Hello, everyone. I am Richard Schmier, President and Chairman of the Board of the Middle East Policy Council, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's program, our 107th Capitol Hill Conference. Our topic today, the rise of China in the Middle East, is quite timely, given that 4 foreign ministers from the Gulf just last week spent several days in Beijing discussing relations between China and the region. Today's Capitol Hill Conference is our 8th to be held virtually since the start of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. This format gives us the opportunity to include panelists and audience members from throughout the US and around the world. So welcome to all of you who are joining us from both near and far. Before I turn to today's program, I would like to say a few words about the Middle East Policy Council. The Council was established in 1981 for the purpose of promoting dialogue and education concerning the US and the countries of the Middle East. We are pleased to be marking our 41st anniversary this year. Among our core programs are our Capitol Hill conferences, such as today's event, our quarterly journal, Middle East Policy, which can be found in more than 16,000 libraries worldwide, and our educational outreach program, Teach Mideast, which provides educational resources for teachers and secondary school students. Please visit us on the web at www.mepc.org and our Teach Mideast program at www.teachmideast.org to learn more about our organization and our activities. Concerning today's event, the conference proceedings will be posted in video and transcript form on our website, as will a recap of the discussion. An edited transcript of the program will be published in the next issue of our journal, Middle East Policy. Now let me turn to our panel. Our first speaker today will be Ms. Camille Lons, a research associate focusing on the Middle East at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Ms. Lon joins us today from Paris. Our second panelist is Dr. John Alterman, Senior Vice President and Middle East Program Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Our third speaker will be Ambassador Chaz Freeman, a Senior Fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Chaz is a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia and President Emeritus and a member of the board of the Middle East Policy Council. Our final speaker will be Congressman Jim Moran, a senior policy advisor at Nelson Mullins, LLP in Washington, D.C. Jim formerly represented Virginia's 8th Congressional District and is a member of the board of the Middle East Policy Council. The moderator of today's discussion is Ms. Basima Al-Hussein, the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council. During the program, I would ask all attendees to be sure to mute their microphones. Please submit your questions to the panelists during the program through the email address info@mepc.org, that is info@mepc.org, or through the Zoom chat box. With that, I am pleased to turn the floor over to Ms. Lons to begin the discussion. Camille?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. So as you said, relations between China and the Middle East have been expanding quite rapidly over the past decade, 2 decades. And since a few years, it's also increasingly attracting attention and concerns from a number of other partners, including the US. If I may, I'll start with explaining a bit what are the drivers of China's interest in the Middle East, because I know that some of my colleagues after are going to cover the Middle Eastern perspective. And I'll give you as well, given that I'm based in the Gulf throughout the year, I'll give you also a bit of elements of what has been concretely happening on the ground. So in terms of the drivers, what drives China and the Middle East, In general, as you all know, this is happening in a context where China is gradually ramping up its posture as a global power. It launched the Belt and Road Initiative with this long-term vision of conquering new markets, exporting its industrial surplus capacity, securing access to critical resources and trade routes as well. And to some extent, positioning itself as well as a challenger of what it sees as US hegemony globally. And in this context, the Middle East was not initially Beijing's foreign policy priority. The region was a bit peripheral at the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's still interesting to Beijing for quite some important reasons. And here, when I say Middle East, in reality, all Middle Eastern countries are not seen as equally interesting for Beijing. So one main interest for China, the main driver is energy and securing access to energy resources. And on this front, obviously, GCC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, are perceived as crucial partners, Iran and Iraq as well to some extent. And almost half of China's imports are coming from the Middle Eastern region. So Beijing sees stability in that region and securing energy access for its own market as crucial. Countries in the Middle East as well are growing consumer markets. There is a strong demand for infrastructure development. So this is interesting to Chinese companies as well. The Middle Eastern countries region are located around quite strategic trade routes, including maritime trade routes that connect China, especially to European markets, which was very important to Beijing. And so maintaining stability of that region and access to these trade routes, and especially to choke points like the Suez Canal or Bab el-Mandeb, this is crucial to Beijing as well. There is a dimension also for China regarding its own Muslim minorities. There are a few thousands of Chinese Uyghur fighters, for example, in countries like Syria or Iraq, and that are of great concern to China in case they return to the country and create instability. So Beijing has been keen to cooperate with some countries in the region to share information and potentially as well to deport some of these Uyghur fighters back to China. And there is also linked to this the reputational perspective as well. And on the international scene, having support from big Muslim majority countries, and especially leaders of the Muslim world like Saudi Arabia, for example, having support from these countries on the Uyghur file on the international scene, this is something that has been of great interest to Beijing as well. And finally, I would say the last driver that is a bit more general, but it's from the geopolitical perspective. Even if Beijing is not really interested in getting entangled into Middle Eastern geopolitics, it's a region that has always been the theater of great power politics. And so creating headways into countries that are important allies of the US is to some extent as well perceived as potentially, useful to Beijing. To this, I'd just make 2 points and takeaways and caveats that are important to keep in mind is that despite all this, it's important to keep in mind that the Middle East is not the top priority for Beijing in its foreign policy. The priority remains on its relationship with the US, with the Asia Pacific region. So that is important because it means that China is not going to necessarily take risks for that region or to in committing to anything on the security side. And it's a relationship that remains quite transactional to some extent, and Middle Eastern countries are not naive about this, and they know very well that China is not going to step up to replace the US as a security provider or to take any risks to defend their interests. And the second point linked to this one is that China maintains a very economic, commercial oriented vision, even if there is an incredible, increasingly geopolitical dimension, especially in the context of the tensions with the US. But it's not interested as well in investing billions in countries that are perceived as unstable and not very profitable. And we've seen that in a number of countries, and I'll come back to that. But in countries like Syria, that we're hoping that China and the BRI would be a new source of investments, that has not really materialized, because at the end of the day, the priority for China and for Chinese companies is making profits and going to countries where there is also an important economic interest for them. So that is for the drivers. And quickly going into what has been happening on the ground. I would say, again, it depends on which countries you look at. I think in the Gulf, especially where I live, it's a region where there has been a lot of activity in recent years. And what is the most striking, I would say, is how the relationship has diversified rapidly in recent years to go beyond the traditional buyer-seller energy relationship. And so we've seen cooperation in a wide range of sectors, in infrastructures, with development of ports, industrial complexes. We've seen cooperation on the digital infrastructures and emerging technologies. So on 5G, cooperation on AI projects, on applications as well that could be used, and that's one of the difficult elements, but the control of the population potentially, like the Huawei, for example, has helped developing apps like Smart Hajj for pilgrims coming into Saudi Arabia, or cooperation with Israel on new technologies as well, cooperation in the field of the health sector. So we've seen that during COVID with cooperation, for example, with a number of countries, especially the UAE, on developing a vaccine, manufacturing it, etc. In renewable energies, solar, etc. And we're seeing in certain elements of an emerging security relationship as well. And so with a purchase of UAVs, the Winglong UAVs on missiles as well, and especially in the GCC, interesting cooperation on potentially manufacturing or developing some of these missiles in Saudi Arabia, or drones in the UAE. So this is an emerging also element of the relationship. And on the diplomatic side, we've seen a greater number of visits at a higher level, and the importance of China on regional files like the JCPOA negotiations, or the fact that China proposed mediating, for example, on the Israel-Palestine file. So there is definitely a momentum happening at the moment. And just to finish here and nuance a little bit, that it's important to put that, when we look at what China is doing, it's important to still put it in perspective with what other partners of the Gulf are doing, because there has been a tendency in recent years to exaggerate a little bit what China was doing in the region and how important it was. And it's one of the partners of the Gulf, but it's not the only one. And with the other big Asian countries, they're also extremely important: Japan, Korea, India. Some of the investments that were announced sometimes from the Chinese side have not always materialized. So it's important as well to put this into perspective and see that, and there is a dimension as well that on the cultural side, there is still a big cultural gap that is important to keep in mind. It's an important factor in doing business or having important political relations, and that cultural gap still remains to be bridged. And so we're not near yet on the ground having the same type of relationship that these countries, the Gulf states, for example, or Middle Eastern countries, are having with Western traditional partners. So I'll finish here, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and hearing my colleagues as well. Thank you.
John, we're over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And it's a great honor to be on a panel with Ambassador Chaz Freeman, from whom I've learned so much. It's also a great pleasure to see in the audience my co-author, John Garver. We wrote a book called The Vital Triangle about China, the United States, and the Middle East back in 2008, which is available on the web. And John and I traveled to the Middle East together. We traveled to China together, and I've learned a great deal from John about China, and it's great to see him. It's important to remember that in 1999, every country in the Middle East had a positive relationship with the United States, or wanted a more positive relationship. And in 2022, that's true of China. It's partly due to an admiration of China, partly due to a growing disaffection with the United States. But more than anything, it's a desire to diversify investments and reap the benefits of what many people see as a rising China. The perception that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East increases the urgency that people in the Middle East feel to deepen their ties with China. I think when you think about what is driving this from the Middle Eastern side, I think you come down to 7 factors. One is that China is a huge oil consumer in the world. China has accounted for almost half of incremental global oil demand growth since 2009, at a time when US and European oil imports have dropped. China is now the largest oil importer in the world. They buy about 20% of the world's traded oil. And India is the only other significant market that's growing at all, although its growth rate is still half of China's. And China imports 2.5 times as much oil as India does. So if you're selling oil, you have to have a relationship with China. China has become, as Camille suggested, an increasingly important trading partner for the Middle East. In 2010, Chinese-Saudi bilateral trade was about $3 billion, dominated by crude oil. It grew, in 2000, it was $3 billion. By 2010, it had grown to $41.6 billion. In 2019, it was $72.3 billion. China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. It is the GCC's largest trading partner, with more than $180 billion in trade a year. And China displaced the European Union as the GCC's largest trading partner in 2020. 60% of Chinese trade to Africa and Europe passes through the UAE, mostly through Dubai. And China's invested more than $10 billion in Israel from 2010 to 2018, about half of which is in the technology sector, half in agriculture. And Chinese firms have invested more than $4 billion in infrastructure construction, all of which raise surveillance concerns from the US side, but it's a sign that there's real money that is driving what's happening between China and the region. China has succeeded in a way that Middle Eastern governments admire and feel they have to emulate. Middle Eastern states are all thinking about the urgent need to grow their own economies and diversify their economies. And they see China as having been tremendously successful, partly because they invested in things like infrastructure. In the 20 years before 2011, China was putting 8.5% of its GDP into infrastructure. And you saw the economy blossom. And for countries that are looking and saying, how do we really jumpstart our economies? The Chinese example is one they want to emulate. As Camille said, there's an idea that China is absolutely a rising power. It is increasingly involved in global diplomacy. It is modernizing its military, and the military budget's increasing 7% a year. The Belton Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China is active on the world scene, and there is a sense that the 21st century may be the Asian century. There is also, and here's the 5th point, a sense that China offers states a way to escape from US hegemony. That's partly the sort of ideological hegemony. The US says you have to do democratization and human rights and private capital and all those things. The US distrust of state-owned enterprises. The fact that for the US, if you want a decision, it's often slow and bureaucratic. And they say, well, that's a private sector issue, that's this agency. And China does things much more quickly. They can get things the US won't sell them, whether it's technology and weapons, and Camille mentioned UAVs, a sense that if you want something from China, you can get it much more quickly than you can get it through any Western system, and it often comes with financing. For countries that have hostile relationships with the United States, like Iran, China is a vital pressure valve. And we can talk, if people are interested, about the way China benefits from US-Iran tensions, but China is a vital partner for Iran. China represents more than 30% of Iran's total trade. And the last issue is that China is a new partner. And at a time when the US seems to be receding from the region, the grass is always greener. And China looks like an answer, and people project their hopes onto the Chinese relationship. Arguably, the US had the same benefit after World War I. The US was new in the Middle East, and Middle Eastern states thought the US would solve all of their problems. That's not a view that a lot of people in the Middle East have now. I think for Middle Eastern states, there are four dangers of getting too close to China. One is these states remain reliant on the United States for security, not just the Fifth Fleet, missile defense, extended deterrence. The US has intelligence capabilities that these states don't have independently. And for states that are concerned, especially about Iranian regional ambitions, the United States is a vital partner. Chinese economic growth isn't assured, and it's actually flattening. People think about China with a double-digit economic growth, but Chinese growth has stalled, and COVID's hurt China tremendously, especially with their lockdown strategies. China also faces a huge demographic challenge as their one China policy comes and bites them and is going to put their dependency index, as the number of people who are not in the workforce is going to rise significantly in the coming years, while the number of workers who support them is going to diminish. China also is a demanding partner on political issues, whether it's Taiwan, the Uyghurs, Tibet. China insists that countries line up behind China. And that's a problem on some of these issues for countries. And I think China also insists on bilateral ties where China is a giant. China doesn't obey the rules. China muscles countries to support Chinese demands. In this Iran relationship, for example, as I said, China represents more than 30% of Iranian trade. Iran represents less than 1% of Chinese trade. And you know who the major partner is, who the senior partner is in that relationship. China talks about win-win relationships. But in reality, countries that are in relationships with China have to deal with the fact that China is a behemoth that doesn't believe in big international rules-based orders, but believes in a relationship where it can squeeze the smaller partner. And we've seen that turning into debt traps in Sri Lanka, in Africa, and elsewhere. There's also the looming problem of what if China really gets the energy transition fast and good as a global economic strategy, but that can leave it totally disinterested in the Middle East. The sense is that Chinese energy demand is going to peak within a decade. And if they get technical advances in electric and renewables, that would not only advance China's economic interests, but it would free China from the Middle East and free China from tangling with the United States in the Middle East, which, as Camille suggested, China is not very interested in doing. So what should the US do about all these things? I think one is the US should put forward a positive vision for the US role in the region. The US has spent a lot of time talking about what it won't do in the Middle East, but I don't think we've talked enough about what we will do. And I think that would help because people fill in all the things we won't do and fill in what US intentions are in a way that's not helpful. We clearly have to establish priorities. We can't care equally about the whole region, and we can't combat every challenge, every place where China shows up. We shouldn't be seeking to dominate them. I think we have to maintain some military presence while building the capacities of our partners. I would note that our global posture review didn't call for a sharp change in the US military presence. I would also note that this idea of building partner capacity and integration among the partners has been on the US wish list for decades, and it's something we're going to have to become more successful at. Camille suggested, and I think we don't think enough about it, we have to capitalize on our cultural power. China isn't going to have the cultural mind space the United States has, partly because it doesn't want it. We have all these advantages with study and travel and language. They're all assets for the United States, which we can build on. And finally, I think we have to engage in the future of the region in economic diversification away from energy production, education, human capital. I think these speak to our core competencies and our core attractions to countries in the region. You know, the George W. Bush administration put tremendous energy into trying to inspire the Arab world. The State Department even came out with this heart and mind thing that they were trying to get people to think about. But the reality is the Arab world already had its own aspirations. And people in governments either saw the US government as either irrelevant to their aspirations or an obstacle to them. I think the way we have to think about China's power in the region is it comes from China's relevance to what states and populations are trying to do. There's a sense that people and governments have that China will help them achieve what they want to achieve. The US has tools to secure remarkable mind space, securing US interests, advancing US priorities, but doing so requires us to think about what we're trying to do, to listen and understand, to see what others are trying to do, and to align our actions with their interests. Thank you.
Okay, Chaz, over to you.
Well, it's very hard to follow two such excellent presentations. There are only so many things you can say about China and the Middle East, and I think Camille got us off to a great start. John successfully refocused us on the supposed rivalry between the United States and China, and so I will address the same issues, but from a different perspective. The gods of war in Washington have decreed that the international situation is now being shaped by two transcendent forces: great power rivalry, especially between our country and China, and authoritarian efforts to dismantle democracy. But I'll argue that trends in the Middle East clearly contradict both this worldview and the US policies that flow from it. To those in the region, the US seems to be combating the China of its nightmares, not the China they observe. Let me begin by spending a couple of minutes reviewing trends and events in West Asia and North Africa over the past year or so. And as I run through these, please ask yourself, what impact, if any, contention between China and the United States had on them? In my view, these are the most notable recent developments in the region. The constraints on Iran's nuclear program imposed by the nuclear deal that the US first hammered out with Iran and then unilaterally abrogated have largely withered away. The UAE has become a major political military actor and astute practitioner of realpolitik, as evidenced in its rapprochements with Iran, Israel, and Turkey. Saudi Arabia is undergoing an astonishing cultural opening and liberalization, even as its de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, remains persona non grata in most of the West. Qatar and the other GCC states are reconciling. Saudi Arabia is seeking an honorable exit from its military misadventures in Yemen and failing to find one. The humanitarian disasters and political impasses in Yemen are worsening, while the suffering in Gaza, Libya, and Syria remains intense, but selectively ignored by the West. Invasive Turkish and US troop presences in Syria persist amidst an appalling lack of international attention to Syria's need for reconstruction. The Arab League is reincorporating Syria, and GCC members are gradually normalizing relations to the Assad government. Turkey has distanced itself from Europe and the United States and seeks to assert both Middle Eastern and pan-Turkic identities. Indigenous defense production capabilities, as Camille mentioned, are beginning to take root in Saudi Arabia. The US brokered Abraham Accords have so far survived, despite the failure of the US to make good on its promised military gifts to the UAE, despite Israel's resumption of aggressive ethnic cleansing and settlement activity in the occupied territories, and despite the growing divergence of Emirati views of Iran from those of Israel. Perhaps those views will now converge after the Houthi attack on Abu Dhabi the other day. Jordan's monarchy has once again surmounted severe internal and external pressures, and Oman has made a successful transition to rule by a new sultan. And finally, efforts by the countries of the region to diversify their political military relationships have accelerated in the wake of America's bungled wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and its passivity in the face of Iranian challenges to Arab states' security. None of these developments was driven either by China or Sino-American contention. The reality is that Arab states are both responding to the opportunities engagement with China affords them and reacting to the perceived unreliability of American protection and the fecklessness of US-Iran policies by hedging their bets, as John mentioned. Israel has its own interests and is resisting American efforts to ban projects with Chinese companies. Iranian decisions are largely reactions to the US policy of, quote, maximum pressure, unquote, which is an approach with a well-established historical record of both futility and catastrophic failure and no record of success. US dollar-based sanctions have compelled Iran's decoupling from the West and driven it towards Central, South, and East Asia. Faute de mieux, Iran is betting that with European and US companies out of reach, it can leverage China's rising prosperity to its own. It's simultaneously pursuing ties to the Russian-dominated Eurasian Economic Union, which is itself increasingly integrated into China's Belt and Road Initiative. The developments I've just listed are the consequences of the end of Euro-American hegemony in West Asia, of long-standing rivalries between the region's various polities, large and small, and of disparate internal political evolutions. Great power rivalry is not the major dynamic reshaping the region. Meanwhile, claims that America is back are belied by its visible retrenchment. And if democracy is not faring well in the Middle East, this reflects local factors exacerbated by the tarnishing of America as a model rather than predatory authoritarianism. For instance, Egypt's military dictatorship is more absolutist than ever. Tunisia has lost its democracy to its government's perceived mismanagement of COVID. The Lebanese state, the economy, and democracy are at death's door, with life support only from Iran and Syria itself enfeebled. Sudan is subject to on-again, off-again military rule. The democratic freedoms of Israeli Jews are contracting, and the Zionist state's heartless mistreatment of its conquered Arab populations is ever more unapologetic. In Turkey, Erdogan has overthrown Kemalism and is busily eroding democracy. Iraqis are tired of being martyred while they wait for democratic governance. The Islamic Republic of Iran's electoral processes have lost credibility with its own citizens. These are, without exception, locally generated developments. And as in the United States, the authoritarian trend is homegrown, not imported. It does not involve China. After ousting governments in Iraq and Libya failed to democratize them, Americans too, for now at least, do not seek to impose our values and system of government on the states of the region. In short, the Middle East In the Middle East, the Washington narrative that Chinese rivalry with the United States or predatory Chinese authoritarianism account for the way the new world disorder is evolving just does not compute. On inspection, China's increasing presence in the Middle East seems driven more by local demand, a point that I think Camille made very effectively, than by a diplomatic or ideological push from Beijing. And this raises a question. If Beijing is not pursuing a zero-sum anti-American game in West Asia and North Africa, or striving to undermine democracy there, what is it doing? And the answer is that China is behaving very much as America did in the first half of the 20th century. Back then, Britain dominated the Middle East. Americans thought that what was good for American oil companies was good for the USA, and that we should focus on the energy trade and avoid taking sides in foreign disputes, and that the region's political cultures were something we should study and learn to live with rather than denounce or subvert. American influence gradually replaced British hegemony. Still, for decades, Washington carefully avoided any implication that it sought to supplant London as the guarantor of regional stability. But when London pulled out, it had little choice but to do so. Now, Beijing is following a similar path, seeking to promote the exchange of goods and services for energy supplies without levying any political or cultural demands and keeping as aloof as it can from entanglement in local disputes. Of course, China is now so big economically that it cannot help but be a growing factor in the regional worldview. Between 2000 and 2020, China's GDP quintupled in size. Its industrial economy is now twice as large as America's, though its services economy remains much smaller. China has become the world's largest consumer market and its biggest importer of hydrocarbons. It is an emerging technological superpower in an increasing number of fields. 1/3 of China's energy imports are from the GCC, with the largest portion from Saudi Arabia. Chinese companies buy 1/6 of GCC oil exports, 1/5 of Iran's, and half of Iraq's. China has become the region's largest foreign investor and trading partner. The states in the region want more, not less, Chinese engagement. As China takes the lead in global technological innovation, it has become a significant collaborator and customer for Israel's high-tech companies, and a partner in Saudi Arabia's efforts to develop a domestic armaments industry. 17 Arab states, some say 19, have joined the Belton Road Initiative. Last week, as Rich mentioned at the outset, the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, as well as the Secretary General of the GCC, were all in Beijing to discuss the expansion of their relations with China. And they were followed by the foreign ministers of Iran and Turkey. Meanwhile, Americans seem determined to evade further political military involvement in West Asia. But as we do this, we create both a vacuum and a real possibility that just as the United States reluctantly succeeded Britain as the dominant power in the Middle East in the last century, China will end up eclipsing America in this century. China's interests echo those that first drew America into engagement with the Middle East. China has a compelling interest in securing reliable access to the uniquely rich energy resources of the Persian Gulf. It sees the region as a crucial entrepot and crossroads for trade and travel between Asia, Europe, and East Africa, making its stability a matter of strategic interest. There is rapidly growing demand for Chinese companies' engineering services, construction capabilities, automotive and telecommunications equipment, armaments, and consumer products. China's citizens and entrepreneurs are establishing an ever larger presence in the region. I think there are now more than 200,000 Chinese resident in the UAE alone. Like America a century ago, China has no apparent imperial or ideological agenda in the Middle East. Unlike today's United States, China does not ask countries in the region to change their political systems and values, punish them for failing to do so, or demand exclusive relationships with them. It has yet to profess any real opposition to continuing American involvement in the region. Instead, it has suggested the formation of a multilateral dialogue on security issues, and when the time is ripe, a regionally managed collective security mechanism for the Gulf. In short, China proposes to help bridge Iranian and Gulf Arab views rather than impose its own or take sides. But the logic of China's interest in the New World Disorder suggests future evolution in Chinese policies. With the US Navy preparing for war over Taiwan and no longer protecting global interests in the Persian Gulf, the Chinese Navy will sooner or later have to assume responsibility for securing China's access to the region and its resources. Chinese civilians in the Middle East will expect and demand protection from natural or human disasters, including terrorist attacks, and, if necessary, emergency evacuation and repatriation. Supporting Chinese interests in a region so distant from China will generate requirements for Chinese naval access to local ports and facilities. This means more installations like the logistics base in Djibouti that supports China's anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Oman and its UN peacekeeping operations in East Africa. China will find it increasingly difficult to avoid the inference by its customers that its arms sales imply defense commitments. Aggressive US opposition to Chinese involvement in infrastructure and other projects in the region will stimulate Chinese efforts to undercut or dislodge US influence in the region. And finally, Sino-Indian naval contention has already begun to focus both countries on being able to impede each other's oil and gas trade with the Gulf. Unlike the United States, China has cordial contact with all parties to the numerous disputes in the region. The former head of Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, recently suggested that China was the only country that could conciliate Iran and other countries in the Middle East. He may be right. For better or ill, China is likely to become an increasing force in efforts to manage peace and security in the Persian Gulf. The question then is whether China will choose to accept an active role in stabilizing the region. Great power rivalry or a putative Manichaean struggle between China and democracy will not drive this decision. On the evidence to date, it will instead reflect the broadly overlapping national interests of China, Europe, India, Japan, and Korea, the fractious states of West Asia and North Africa, and the United States. All share a compelling interest in a stable Middle East whose quarrels do not export radicalism or endanger access to crucial energy supplies. It would be in America's interests for China and other countries that rely on Middle Eastern energy exports to share the burden of preserving global prosperity by coming together to safeguard the world's energy trade. If China faces a choice in this regard, so does America. The United States can cooperate to mutual advantage with China, other rising powers, and the oil-producing countries of the region, or it can overwrite obvious interests it shares with China and others with irrational antagonism and pursue a pointless game that no one can hope to win. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaz. Jim, over to you. You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Which may not matter. I'm just digesting what I've heard. I'm obviously honored to be on the same panel with so many intelligent, thoughtful, experienced people on this subject. And it's a wonderful thing for the audience. For me, not so much as cleanup batter here. because I'm going to have to apologize in advance for being invariably repetitive of what has already been said, because I obviously don't disagree with anything that's been said. When you had a perfect storm, that's when you have to tack in a different direction. And I think while the United States, relatively speaking, sailed in one expansive direction now for several generations, I do think it's time to tack in a different direction, certainly in terms of our relationship in the Middle East. We've already started doing that. We are going to withdraw militarily, at least, from the much of our current presence. We're not going to shut down Al-Udeid base, but we will have a diminished military presence. And that's for several reasons. The principal one is that the United States doesn't need the Middle East like it used to. We saw the Middle East as our deepest oil well, and it powered our economy for generations. That's no longer the case. We don't necessarily need Saudi oil nor the fossil fuels from its neighbors now, given domestic fracking and given our determined transition to green energy. But beyond the reduced economic need for power from the Middle East, in many ways, the vast majority of the Congress, and certainly this administration, doesn't really want to deal with much of the current leadership in the Middle East. There is still a deep animosity towards Mohammed bin Salman for the killing, dismemberment of a U.S. journalist. The Post certainly is never going to let Washington forget that, nor will the Times or many others. General Sisi is seen by this administration, much of the Congress, as a somewhat ruthless military dictator. He's still getting money from us, but obviously that's because of the prior accords with Israel. And MBZ, while he's not held in as unfriendly a relationship, there are obviously so many atrocities in Yemen and other reasons with the money laundering and so on that goes on in the UAE. I think that's a somewhat problematic situation as well. So we don't need the Middle East, and many people in decision-making authority don't necessarily want to deal with the leaders of the Middle East. Beyond that, Israel doesn't need U.S. protection to the extent that it used to. Much of our Middle East policy was Israeli-centric. And now with the Abrahamic Accords, Israel doesn't feel as endangered, except by Iran. And the reality is that we don't think that Israel is in the situation that it used to be when our foremost objective in the Middle East was to protect its only democratic ally there. So those dynamics have changed dramatically. And now let me talk a bit about China. We have empowered China, first of all. We ought to acknowledge that. I mean, we've lent them the trillions of dollars that they have lent us the trillions of dollars that we've used largely to buy their stuff. I mean, Walmart is one of the largest corporations in the world. if you go into a Walmart store, most of the products have been made in China. We have enabled their economic growth. So it was almost inevitable that because it is a authoritarian government, that they were going to eventually have a leader who had global ambitions. That leadership has been largely unrestrained. We pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership during the Trump administration. I think that was one of the worst, most consequential decisions that the United States could possibly have made, because it yielded hegemony over the entire Asian Pacific region to a communist dictator, and China seized it. It's a vacuum that has enabled China to expand in a much more aggressive manner. I would urge people who are interested in this subject to read Xi Jinping's address to Davos this week. It is extraordinarily aggressive. It is demanding, almost to the point of being arrogant. But he plans to go through with it, and he probably can, in terms of his determination to be the dominant artificial intelligence power in the world, to not allow the U.S. to interfere with his determination to dominate the digital global communications network. He's warning us that we can't interrupt the world's dependence upon their supply chains. So we're now dealing with something that I think is going to present some extraordinary challenges to the U.S. And what at one point seemed like U.S. hegemony, at least in terms of our values of democracy, human rights, rule of law, and freedom of expression, et cetera, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve anything near what we had envisioned just a quarter century ago, even. So things have changed. And I think the wild card, though, is the various populations of these countries whose leadership is increasingly authoritarian. I appreciated Mr. Altman's description of some of the challenges that China has. They're substantial. They are indebted. And they're having a great deal of difficulty in having the kind of younger population that spurs economic growth. And I'm not sure that Xi Jinping is as popular as he thinks he is, and certainly not as popular as he wants to be. I think it would be fascinating if there was going to be an actual democratic election, which of course is not going to be held. But I worry greatly that there is an alliance developing. If you see where the Belton Road Initiative has taken China, they go into a country, and generally they're fairly well received. Obviously, they bring a lot of money with them. Now they're not bringing as much financial investment in hard infrastructure as they had, but they've got a lot to offer. In terms of the Middle East, there's a critical element in terms of the relationship which has been, I think, difficult with the United States, because when we talk with Middle East rulers, we invariably bring up the things that trouble our population, our Congress, and our State Department and Defense Department. But when China talks with most Middle East rulers, they don't care. The Middle East rulers don't care about the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They don't care about what has happened in Hong Kong. They do the same. If China wanted to invade, Taiwan, they're certainly not going to stand in the way. Human rights is not an issue. Authoritarianism is not an issue. Suppression of free speech, that's certainly not an issue. And so there isn't that kind of clash that invariably occurs in our diplomatic discussions with the Middle East. So the China's bringing money. They are bringing a world outlook that has much more commonality with many of the rulers in the Middle East, and it's they are also willing to be a bridge between some of the rulers and the people that they're most concerned about. China's, as has been said, China's going to be the bridge between Iran, the Shia nations and the Sunni nations. It's obviously not a sectarian conflict as much as it is a conflict in terms of power and influence and differing objectives. But the reality is that China could bridge that conflict between the Shia nations and the Sunni nations, for lack of a better description of the conflicting countries. China can bring Turkey into the mix. Erdogan is much more comfortable dealing with Xi Jinping than he is with Joe Biden. So if you bring in Iran, Turkey, Russia, and these Middle East countries that have substantial wealth, you can form an alliance, which I think we need to be very much worried about. And that's really the point of a discussion like this, not just understanding where we are today in terms of China's role in the Middle East, but what is going to look like tomorrow? What is going to look like even within a decade? There's a clear conflict going on right now throughout this world in terms of authoritarian governments versus democratic governments. And Europe and the United States, I think, are losing ground. So the defense budget for FY23 is China-centric now. It contemplates what you'd do if there was a conventional war. Conventional war isn't going to happen. But I think we're very vulnerable in terms of the kind of cyber conflict that can be conducted. I think we're very vulnerable in terms of the economic relationships that we still depend upon. Europe's not growing. And while we're still growing economically and to some extent population-wise, largely because of immigration, we cannot become a vestige of past history. We've got to take the leadership, and I'm not sure that we're moving in the direction that I think we need to. So the one wild card, like I mentioned, it's the population. A lot of these countries, other than China, have very young populations. They communicate through social media in ways that, no matter how determined the country's leadership, can't fully suppress. They're able to access programs like this, and I think they want something better than they're going to get from an authoritarian government. And if it was left to them, do you really want China playing a major role in terms of your future, I think most of them would say, no, not so much. We'd rather the United States. And that may be our greatest strength. So with that, let me turn it over to much more informed members of the panel and particularly the audience we have today. But thank you for including me.
Thank you so much, Congressman Moran, and a huge thank you to our entire panel. That was such a fascinating opening set of remarks. Just to remind everybody, if you have a question for any of the panelists, you can submit it via the chat in a direct message to me, or you can submit it to our email address, info@mepc.org. And if your question is for a particular panelist, please indicate that. Also, please identify the organization that you work with and your job title, or if you are a student at an educational institution, please identify yourself as well. So my first big question that I have for you all is, how has the United States' recent withdrawal from Afghanistan and the coinciding Taliban takeover impacted China's foothold in the Middle East, if at all?
Well, I'll venture, while the other panelists are coming up with more thoughtful, informed responses, the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan was messy. In some cases, it was almost embarrassing. I don't think that we should have done it in the way that we did, frankly. But the reality is that we were supporting a government that didn't have sufficient support among the population. There was far too much corruption. We weren't making sufficient progress in terms of achieving our objectives. But I think we left far too many people who were dependent upon us, our presence there. We left them vulnerable to the Taliban, and they're suffering today because of their belief in us, in the United States and its allies, its European allies. We can't undo that damage. We should have done what the Institute for Peace recommended, is to keep a residual force of maybe 20,000 people that would have continued to train the military. We should have had people trying to deal with the endemic corruption to a greater extent. I mean, we kept people in South Korea, we've kept people in Germany. There's ample precedent, but we didn't. It's done. I understand why it was done, and the majority of the Congress, while they were very critical, they were not supportive of continuing to stay in Afghanistan. But it has undermined our credibility throughout the world. It's going to be a problem for other countries to turn to the United States as their savior, if you will. And I think that the countries that feel as though they're not allies of the United States. They're resentful. They're threatened by the United States. I think that they are somewhat empowered by our withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's unfortunate, and that impression it's throughout the world. But I think in the Middle East it has had an impact, and I think a negative impact in terms of our reputation and the level of trust that is afforded the United States.
Let me follow up on that, if I may, briefly. I think the principal effects of the Afghan withdrawal have been probably two or threefold. First, in the region, there is an increased perception of American disengagement from the region, a lessened commitment, and a pivot toward East Asia. And that automatically, as I said, creates a sort of vacuum. I don't think the Chinese aspire to fill that vacuum, but they're being pulled into it. The countries in the region have responded by redoubling their efforts to diversify their relationships internationally. That's why all those foreign ministers were in Beijing last week. But the other response of the Chinese has been not in the Middle East, but in Central Asia, where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is emerging as an effective manager of relationships with the new Taliban regime in Afghanistan, or at least attempting to do so. We've seen there's a shared concern among all of the neighbors of Afghanistan, including Pakistan, about potential for the export of radical ideas and activities from that country, and everybody is trying to come together to prevent that. But I don't see the Chinese as acting predatorily. I think they're being drawn in by countries that are seeking reassurance.
I just add a slightly more positive note to this, and that is the consequence of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was it forced the U.S. to cooperate incredibly deeply and broadly with a number of key Middle Eastern partners. So on the one hand, there's this signpost that the U.S. is on its way out of the region. But on the other hand, the U.S. couldn't have begun to do what it did without close cooperation with the Qataris, without getting support from the Emiratis and others. You know, the fact that we do have these relationships on the military side, on the civilian side, shared airfields, all those kinds of things reinforced the differential between what the US can do and what a country like China can do. Right. China had the challenge of its life trying to get 30,000 Chinese out of Libya when Gaddafi fell. They had a real problem getting 5,000 Chinese out of Yemen. I mean, what the U.S. did, you could say it was shambolic, you could say it was unfortunate, it was misguided, all those things. But in terms of moving people, the U.S. moved people out of Afghanistan, and it relied largely on cooperation from strong Gulf partners to get it done in a very short period of time.
It's a very good point you make, John. And Qatar Air, for example, was absolutely essential. Tony Blinken, even the president, has acknowledged Qatar's role, particularly, it was absolutely essential to evacuating as many people as were, the tens of thousands. But in terms of reputation, it strengthened allies in the Middle East, but did it strengthen our the level of trust and confidence that other countries have in us? And I think that was perhaps the greatest loss. Excuse me for interrupting.
Okay, excellent. So I'm collecting a lot of questions from the audience right now. And while I continue to refine those, I have another question for you all. Could you speak a little bit more, each of you, to the dynamic with Egypt? Clearly, Egypt is accepting more aid from China. It's very attractive because there's no strings attached. And Egypt, while not extremely strong economically, has always played such a significant role in the region, in part due to its location and so on and so forth. So how do you see the relationship between Egypt and China playing out, and the increase in cooperation with Russia?
I think, go ahead, John, please.
Sure. First, I think there's not a lot of Chinese aid to Egypt. There's Chinese business with Egypt. Certainly, China considers Egypt to be a key partner, I think largely because of its location, with the Suez Canal being so important for Chinese trade. Also, Egypt has more than 100 million people, so it's a big power in the Middle East. But China's relationship to Egypt, it seems to me, was made very clear. The Chinese were deeply involved building this new administrative capital for Egypt. And then the company said, you know what, we're going to take a breather, because, as a Chinese friend told me, the Egyptians thought they were the only ones who were allowed to make money on the deal. And the Chinese were in it not to help Egypt. They were there because it was a business proposition. And the Egyptians had to make concessions to get China back in. China's back to building the capital. There's a free trade zone in Suez that the Chinese are involved in. But I think China sees Egypt as a business proposition. Egypt sees China as a vital way to get away from the footprint of the United States, or under the thumb of the United States, complaining about the Egyptians all the time. And certainly I've had senior Egyptian officials explain at length to me about how they can go shopping, they can get things from the Chinese, from the Russians. I think for Egypt, the US is always the preferred partner, but the US is a partner with a very long, difficult, emotional relationship that the Egyptians sort of strain against. And there's a desire for, let's just do stuff with the Chinese. It's going to be so much better because there's not going to be the emotional baggage, the cultural baggage that we've been struggling with the Americans with for so long. It's funny, when I talk to the Chinese about Egypt, they have a much less rosy attitude toward it. It's pretty clinical. They are very frustrated by things in Egypt. They are frustrated with the Egyptian government, but they say, you know what, we can make this work. There's a fascinating Peter Hessler article in the New Yorker about 5 years ago. Peter was based in China and then was based in Egypt. And he went and spoke to Chinese merchants in Egypt about what it's like to work in Egypt. And the Chinese look and they say, I don't know why this country works this way. I can't imagine, because it's so inefficient. It's not the way it should be done. There's not the same work ethic. I think that there's the Egyptian view of how China is going to be the savior of Egypt, and this is going to be a key partnership. I don't think is the Chinese view. I think the Chinese view is there's something here to exploit, and we'll exploit what there needs to exploit. There's something here to protect. We're going to protect what we need to protect, and not much more. I think the Russians have a more complicated view. The Russians see a way to counter the United States a little bit. The Russians see a way to get a little bit more of a foothold in the Eastern Med. They have interest in Libya and other places. But I think the Russians are tactical about Egypt, very tactical. I think the Chinese are strategic but circumspect. And I think, and probably appropriately so.
Let me add 2 points. First, read the Peter Hessler article. It's very interesting indeed. And it illustrates a point which most people overlook, and that is that 90% of the Chinese presence in Africa, of which Egypt is part, is private, not state enterprise. And there are almost 3 million Chinese now resident in Africa, and doing what Peter Hessler article describes, is selling lingerie and other things to local people, and in some cases doing small-scale local manufacturing. So this is not your classic state enterprise, predatory state capitalism kind of thing, and it is sustained by the ability to make profits. Second point is that Egypt went to sleep about 35 years ago, and is now emerging from that slumber diplomatically. It's active with the Russians, renewed its arms supply relationship with the Russians, for example. It is actively pursuing rapprochement with Turkey. It is, again, very interested in Syria, which was a historic partner for Egypt. And it is working with the Jordanians and Iraqis on a sort of almost a replay of the old Arab Cooperation Council, strategic cooperation. So Egypt, which was a relatively passive actor for the last quarter century, is, despite its internal difficulties, and a regime which is undoubtedly more repressive than even the Mubarak regime was at its height, Egypt is more engaged, more of a factor, and it brings to bear in the region a very good diplomatic service, which most of the other countries don't really have. So I think the Chinese look at Egypt and they see a country that is again reasserting regional influence, and they are responding to that.
Well, the administrative city outside Cairo is going to be a lost leader. for China, as John suggests. But Chaz, isn't that very substantial Chinese investment in the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia? Isn't that state-sponsored money?
Yeah, in general, this gets to the nature of the Belton Road Initiative, which is essentially a mobilization strategy modeled on China's domestic industrial policies. And that is, the state declares a broad objective. It empowers the state lending authorities, the banks, the public policy banks, to lend to projects that fit into that broad objective. But then it leaves it to companies, whether they're state-owned or private, to find projects that work. And it's all in the nature of that Deng Xiaoping cross the river by feeling the stones with your feet approach. It's not centrally directed. I think the Renaissance Dam is an interesting replay in our minds in some ways of the Aswan Dam, which played such a role in switching Egypt from toward the Soviet Union. And but I don't see it in that light. I don't think it's strategic. I think it's commercial mainly, and whether they make money or not is going to be an interesting question. I would take issue with one comment that John made about debt trap diplomacy. That's actually our specialty. William Howard Taft was the master of it. And interestingly, the Chinese Revolution of 1911 was in response to a bond issuance that the United States forced on the Chinese to build a railroad from Wuhan to Guangzhou called the Huguang Railway. And this aroused such nationalist passion that it set off mob riots and protests, which then blossomed into Sun Yat-sen's Republic of China. So I don't think Hambantota is a loss leader. It's a stranded asset, not a debt trap. And I think those who've looked at this closely haven't really found much evidence of debt traps anywhere. You can ask the Argentines about debt traps. They keep getting themselves into one, and usually it's the banks in New York that own the traps.
If I may just add,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
If I may just add quickly to John's point as well, I agree with what he was saying, that there was business to be done in Egypt and the Chinese jumped in, but I think, and it's not just in Egypt, but you have a number of Middle Eastern countries that are returning a little bit from this hope that China would save them and economically. And when you look actually at the numbers of FDIs, for example, into the region, Chinese FDIs in Egypt are a drop in comparison with FDIs made from Europe or from GCC countries, actually, or from the US. And to just give numbers from the aggregated on the MENA region in general, FDIs from China in 2018 were about $25 billion, which is a good number. US FDIs into the region were almost $100 billion, so four times more. From the EU, it was $265 billion, so 10 times more than FDIs from China. And I'm not even talking about FDIs made from Japan, from India and South Korea. Japanese FDIs for certain countries are quite high as well. So it's important not to overstate, and same things for the loans. The Chinese loans in the region are quite limited in a certain number of countries, especially countries that are less economically interesting for China, like Syria, where there was a hope that China would come and save the Syrian economy and reconstruct it. It's been absolutely disappointing. So it's important, I think, to just put these numbers and compare them to what countries like the US, the EU, or even GCC countries are investing in the region.
Excellent, thank you. So our first question for the panel is from Mr. Josh Landis, who is the director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And the question is, has Washington changed its attitude towards the control of oil as a strategic commodity and the Persian Gulf as the source of much of the world's energy? Does remaining a superpower still require controlling energy supply? Congressman Moran, you touched a little bit on that in your opening remarks. Does anybody else want to address that question?
I think the importance of oil and Middle Eastern oil began with the British and with Churchill when he was the chief of the Admiralty and undersaw a conversion of the British Navy from coal to oil. It's been eroded over the years. Obviously, U.S. aircraft carriers are nuclear powered, but more particularly, the United States is now the swing producer for oil globally. We are a net exporter again, as we were for much of this century and the last century, I'd say. And so while it's important, I think it's probably less important. And certainly the United States doesn't act anymore as though it has the importance it used to. So you see a tanker being taken in the Strait of Hormuz, and the US response is, well, let's see if other people will come help us deal with that, which they mostly didn't. I think the French and a few others did come, but not put themselves under US command. The mighty Navy of Albania did put itself under US command, so something happened from outside. But for the most part, the response was from Persian Gulf Arab countries, not outsiders. Other countries have responded to the diminished American influence. There's now a Japanese fleet fairly regularly in the region. The South Koreans have sent their own naval vessels there. Obviously, the Chinese are not there, except now they're beginning to conduct joint exercises with Iran and other countries in the region. There will soon be an exercise with Russia, China, and Iran taking place. And this, I think, may be the forerunner to what I suggested was likely to happen, namely the Chinese, who are the world's major oil importers, will be under increasing pressure to provide their own support, their own defense of their strategic lines of communication, and this will lead them to be in the region. But overall, I think, Josh, the importance of oil for military purposes for the United States is less. It hasn't disappeared, but it is demonstrably less when measured by our behavior and attention than it was.
Can I just add to that? I think there's an issue of how do you supply a military, but there's then also the issue of the importance of oil to the global economy.
Right.
And oil is a globally traded commodity. If it's blocked somewhere, the market around the world responds. And I think the United States in recent years has had a sort of ambivalence. On the one hand, it's looking forward to a point where oil is no longer driving the economy. But when oil prices go up, then the White House is always on the phone with Middle East producers and say, won't you produce a little more oil and help the economy recover from this? So I think we end up a little bit ambivalent about this because we have a role safeguarding the global economy, which is still important, protecting sea lanes of communication, which I think is something that people still care about in strategic thinking, not so much to support the US Navy, but to support the US economy, to support the US role in global security. And oil still plays an important role in that. And I think sometimes people jump ahead to a point in 30 years when that's less the case. But I think right now it is the case. And if there were a serious threat to the global energy trade, the United States would take that as a security threat, especially if you saw oil prices leap up as a consequence?
Inshallah. I would say that the response, what's on the phone when the president calls whoever he calls, obviously he does not call Mohammed bin Salman, which may be the problem. But he calls and he talks about US domestic oil prices, gas prices. It's political, domestic. Several decades ago, it would have all been about the global prosperity that's affected by oil prices. That's not the case anymore. Remember America First? We shucked off a great deal of the responsibility that we'd long carried for sustaining global prosperity. And while there are people, of course, who think we should continue to be concerned for very rational purposes and reasons about global prosperity, I don't think that drives policy. And I note that the recent rise in oil prices led us to approach the Chinese and others with a request that they release strategic oil reserves. And we did a bit of that ourselves. But this was about the price of gas at the pump here. And we don't have policies like Europeans who have high taxes on gasoline in order to suppress demand and produce policies that reduce reliance on imports of hydrocarbons and stimulate renewable resources. And we have quite the opposite. We have a very confused energy policy, and I agree with you, John. The confusion makes it very difficult to judge what exactly we're after.
Excellent, thank you. So our next question is from Nabil Khoury, who is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council and a retired Foreign Service officer. His question is, one area that the US has been failing at consistently in the Middle East is conflict resolution. Do you think China has any interest in and ability to fill that gap, i.e. in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, etc.?
Well, let me start on that. And Nabil, I like your beard. Haven't seen you for a while. Jim Moran mentioned this, and I think it is something that countries in the region would very much welcome. I think the Chinese are extremely reluctant to get into this, and for good reason. I think it was, I can't remember the exact quotation, but a Greek philosopher named Bias, of all things, once said that if you try to conciliate two people, you will lose a friend and make an enemy. You generally speaking don't prosper if you get in the middle between quarreling parties. And the Chinese have been very reluctant to get in the middle. They've been masterful at maintaining good relations, for example, with Israel, while they also have good relations with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So I think the answer to the question is they have the potential to do things, as the head of Mossad mentioned. The likelihood they will is very low. And that goes to the points that Camille made at the outset about the overwhelming commercial focus of Chinese policy in the region. Now that may eventually evolve into something, but so far it has not. I would add one footnote to this, however, and that is one of the results of the Afghan withdrawal, to go back to the other question, has been a degree of activism on the diplomatic front by the Chinese in response to demands from the region. Wang Yi, for example, embracing a version of the Iranian-Russian suggestion of a regional collective security organization, and suggesting that China could be helpful in composing relationships between countries in the region. What that means in practice, I don't know. The Chinese have said in the past that they would conciliate Palestinians and Israelis. And as far as I can tell, they haven't done anything. So this may be happy talk and nothing more.
But I think the Chinese love to be in the room. I mean, I remember being in China, I think maybe with John Garver 15 years ago, and hearing Chinese talk about how about we join the quartet when the Israeli-Palestinian peace process seemed maybe like it was going to go somewhere, maybe. And the Chinese really wanted to be in the quartet. I think the Chinese really appreciate being part of the P5+1, not because they want to do something, but because they want to, A, show their great power position and their presence, and B, use the fact that they can veto things to derive benefits for other parts of their policy. I think the Chinese are loving the fact that they can blow up the P5+1 negotiations, because at a time when there's contestation with the United States needs China to move forward its policy. And that's the China's advantage, not because it's going to heal the rift, but because China derives leverage when it's part of these processes and people need China to be on board.
I agree with that. Part of it, though, is like the Russians on North Korea. They want to be there because if they're there, they're recognized as a great power. They actually don't contribute very much, if anything. So I think you're right. There's a bit of vanity here. And it goes back to the Chinese desire, which you mentioned in your earlier remarks, John, to have deference and respect from others. This is a key value to get. Face is the self-esteem that comes from the respect of people you respect, and they respect the great powers. And as you said, they want to be in the room, therefore, even if they don't do anything.
Excellent, thank you. And this is actually an excellent segue to our next question, which is from Carol Silver, who is a current research assistant at the Washington Institute, and it is directed at Camille. She says, thank you for your fantastic presentation. You mentioned that the Middle East is not a top priority for Beijing. Can you discuss what, if anything, would change that or would have to change for the status quo to shift, and whether any shift is likely or unlikely? Also, how should watchers of this topic understand the recent flurry of diplomatic engagements with China in light of Beijing's view?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think it was mentioned already a bit in the conversation. Like, the big question is, to what extent could China find itself entangled into Middle Eastern geopolitics against its own will, just because of, growing economic stakes in the region, and that may come with political ties, and just finding itself tied to some of the politics of the region. But I would tend to think that the general trend at the moment is probably, and John actually mentioned that, but with the changes in the global energy markets, the long-term trends in terms of energy transition, my sense is that from the Chinese perspective, and the effort as well from the Chinese perspective to diversify their energy sources with other countries outside of the Middle East, Brazil, Russia, Angola, etc., it tends to push them towards a situation where they don't necessarily see, when it comes to energy, specifically Middle Eastern countries, as strategic as what they could have been in the past. And so this thing of finding themselves entangled around, for example, the need to secure access to energy resources, that we might be on the actually a direction where this might be less and less the case in the future. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is from Bill Jones, who is the Washington Bureau Chief for EIR News Service. He states that it has long been clear that the basic problem with the Middle East has been a lack of economic development. Does it not behoove the US in some way to work together with China on a program in order to change the dismal economic situation in the region? Ambassador Freeman, you're on mute.
Sorry. And I think that this raises an immediate question: what is the Middle East? Certainly, the Gulf is not underdeveloped at this point. If you're speaking of the Levant, Israel is not underdeveloped. Syria has essentially been destroyed, and nobody seems to be able to figure out how to do anything about that or make money by doing something about it. Iraq has been pummeled into the earth. Lebanon is a basket case. But I wouldn't generalize in that fashion. I think there are, however, issues that affect everybody. One is climate change. A country like Kuwait may become essentially uninhabitable due to levels of heat that are beyond the capacity for human beings to sustain life in. This is something that really ought to be a concern of everybody in the region. I think the issue of water, well, we don't know there's climate shift going on. You know, and 4,000 years ago, there was a monsoon that reached into much of the Arabian Peninsula, and there were water holes with hippopotamuses down in what is now the Rub al Khali. So we don't know where this is going, but water supplies are a major issue. And as you know, in Saudi Arabia, there are no river, there's no natural flow of rivers, everything is desalinated. The Saudis have largely depleted the aquifers when they went in for wheat production. What is the solution? There's certainly a reason for countries in the region to cooperate. So far, this has been done on a commercial basis. Much of the technology has been Japanese and Korean, not Chinese. The Israelis have their own technology, which parallels that of others. And perhaps now that there's a bit of an opening for Israel in trade, some of this technology will find its way into other Middle Eastern countries. Agriculture obviously depends on water, and there have been, civilization arose in Mesopotamia, and this was because of the Tigris and Euphrates and the ability to build irrigation off it. But that's drying up. I think there's a huge issue for the world with many, many implications, including an outflow of people, which we already see. In the case of Syria, due to war, disabling Turkey. Turkey's had to take in millions of refugees. Europe has been swamped in refugees, and that has changed European politics, not for the better. So I think this is a proper concern, but I'd caution against generalization. There are some countries that are impoverished, and there are others that are hyper wealthy. Nobody ever accused Qatar of being poor. I think we need to differentiate.
Excellent, thank you.
If I may.
Oh, please, yes.
Sorry, if I may just add to that as well. When it comes to development, especially infrastructure development, it might be difficult to do without the Chinese at this point, because they're just, yes, the Japanese and the Koreans have been providing a lot of infrastructure to the region, but more recently the Chinese have been competing quite a lot on this, because they're just cheaper, they're just much quicker, they're leading quite a lot on the EPC side, and they're getting better as well in terms of quality. So there is no reason in itself not to work with them. But if I may just add something from the French perspective, because I know that the French Agency for Development, the AFD, has been having this challenge of working with the Chinese on the development side. And their main thing was to try to work with the Chinese to bring them in line with their standards and regulations when it comes to developments, and because the big problem of having a player like China on the development side is that China doesn't necessarily have exactly the same approach to development that OECD countries have, and so there is a real there is a real thing of trying to bring them in line with some of the standards that we have developed over time, and trying to work with them. But the big challenge for the AfD is that by trying to work with the Chinese on this front, they ended up financing a lot of projects that then was taken by Chinese companies for development in Africa and the Middle East. And so there was a bit this issue of, wait a minute, like we are financing Chinese companies to come do development projects in these countries. So there is this thing of, you cannot not do it. You cannot avoid China completely, because just they're a massive player, and they can deliver a lot for the region. But at the same time, yes, there is this need of trying to make sure that you're not opening the door more to Chinese companies and financing them and helping them even more to penetrate some of these markets. But,
may I underscore one point that Camille just made, which is really very, very important. And that is that one of the grave areas of damage to the global economy and to US foreign policy, to everyone's interests, is the division of the world into competing technospheres in which standards differ. You can see what's happening most clearly in the telecommunications area with the effort to exclude Huawei, although Huawei has the world's largest collection of patents in the telecommunications area and bids fair to become the dominant technology provider in much of the world. But it's not just in that area. The question of standards, which were once set universally, this is now being divided by global rivalries. And I think we need to think about that in the context of the question that Bill Jones asked. You know, how are we going to respond to some of the challenges in the Middle East over water, climate change, population shifts, and so forth? The Chinese, obviously, domestically have developed what is clearly the most efficient and effective technologies for infrastructure development. If you just go on YouTube and look at how rapid rail is being laid out in China. By the way, they're increasing that. They propose to increase that by 1/3 over the next 5-year plan. And interestingly, for Americans, they intend to ensure that a letter dropped in a post box anywhere in China reaches an address in the same city the next day, and any other city within 2 days. Take that, Mr. DeJoy. So I will stop here.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. The next question is directed to Dr. Alterman. However, everybody feel free to weigh in if you like. The question is, with the recent implementation of the Iran-China 25-year cooperation program and the continued Belt and Road Initiative, how does the ever-growing Chinese presence in the region pose a threat to U.S. goals? How should the Biden administration respond to not only Chinese, but Russian growing influence in the Middle East?
I think there are 2, maybe 3 very different questions in there. And then let me try to answer as many as I can succinctly. First, I think the reports of Chinese-Iranian cooperation are sometimes overblown. I think it serves both sides' interests to do that. I think the reality of that relationship is that China sees utility in its relationship with Iran, and Iran doesn't have much choice. It needs China. It needs China economically. It needs China diplomatically. And China is really the overwhelming power. I think there are press releases about how much it's doing, partly to serve Chinese interests, partly to serve Iranian interests. But this is really a relationship of profound unequals. And I don't think the Iranians doubt for a second that the Chinese will do whatever serves Chinese interests. I mean, Camille had talked about how transactional these relationships are. I think the most transactional relationship is Iran. It is great for China to have Iranian-US tensions. It draws US troops out of the Western Pacific. It creates sometimes friction between the US and its allies. Certainly it did during the Trump administration. It does all kinds of things, and because no other countries are willing to invest in Iran, it allows Chinese investors to go in and get bargain basement prices. But China uses Iran. China sees Iran as a useful way to guarantee access to oil the US can't control, because I think there's a part of Chinese thinking that thinks that the US is really so deeply embedded into the Gulf that if the US wanted to get the Gulf partners to cut off oil to China, they might, but Iran wouldn't, and Iran gives the possibility for a land route for oil that the US couldn't circumvent with the Navy. So I think we have to look at this relationship with a little bit of a critical eye. And I'm not sure that we have to treat it as a threat. There's a broader set of interests that Russia has in the Middle East. Again, I think Russia is opportunistic in the Middle East, much more opportunistic even than the Chinese. I think they look for places, especially places that are suffering, and they tend to run in, whether it's Syria, whether it's Libya. They look for places where they can invest very little and reap something, either because they're there for the landing or because they can move something along. It's important to remember that the Russian investment in Syria was fewer than 5,000 troops and 24 fixed-wing aircraft, and they turned the course of the Syrian civil war. You could argue it's because they had absolutely no regard for civilian life, but the fact is the Russians invested very little and reaped a lot as a consequence, partly because they became a global power player. I think it's hard to change the way the Russians approach the Middle East. I think it is embedded in a broader set of issues, from Russia's desire for global standing. I think it's out of a rivalry between the US and Russia that's very hard to unpack, and we're seeing that in the Ukraine now. I think it is possible to chart broader areas of cooperation, or at least non-competition, between the US and China on shared issues. And certainly there are issues. China doesn't want a highly proliferated Middle East. It doesn't serve Chinese interests. China doesn't want conflicts that cut off the world's access to oil. So I think there are ways to build patterns of somewhat greater cooperation between the US and China on narrow issues in the Middle East. The interesting thing, though, and here's the irony, when I talk to senior US officials, they tell me, with the Russian relationship, we're actually able to compartmentalize. And that the overall relationship may be horrible, but we can work cooperation on issues like Libya or Syria, and it doesn't get poisoned by the broader tone. I'm told we can't do that with China, that there's a way in which tension in any part of the relationship infects the entire relationship. And I think if we can find ways to replicate what we've managed to do with the Russians, and do that more with the Chinese on areas of common interest, it can help advance the interests of both sides.
Mute myself. Hello, excellent, thank you. And that actually ties in just a little bit with an earlier question we received from Bill Jones, who is the Washington Bureau Chief for EIR News Service. So when the US is thinking about China in the region, do any of you think there's any possibility that the US might consider using the same playbook it did to combat Soviet expansion westward, by supporting Islamist movements in the Middle East?
In a sense, the US has been attempting to do that with the issue of the Uyghurs, pounding away on the issue of Chinese mistreatment of a Muslim minority in Western China. That hasn't gained traction. I see there's a question for someone in India, and I'll just anticipate. The question is, why hasn't the US persuaded Muslim countries, especially in the Middle East, to pick up the issue of the Uyghurs and charge with it? And the answer is very simple. From the viewpoint of people in the region, this is a clear case of American selective outrage. Americans are not outraged, apparently, about the treatment of Muslims in Kashmir. Americans are not outraged about the treatment of Muslims in Chechnya. Americans are not outraged about Palestinians and their mistreatment. We are silent on the issue of the Gaza ghetto, for example. So then when we turn around and profess to be terribly concerned about Uyghurs in a place called Xinjiang, which no one can find on the map, this isn't very persuasive. It looks like what it is, which is part of a broad assault on the Chinese reputation. And this brings me to John's point, or rather not John's point, but the point he cites American officials as making. In my own experience with the Chinese, which involved running the embassy and acting as charge and DCM in Beijing for 4 years, the one thing the Chinese are really, really good at is compartmentalization of things. But the prerequisite for that is respect. Everything the United States has done has been designed to show disrespect. And in those circumstances, the Chinese will not compartmentalize. I think the answer actually is that the United States needs to compartmentalize a bit. Perhaps instead of talking about competition and then only at the end cooperation and coming up with no proposals for cooperation, we should do the same thing with China, John, that you suggested correctly we do with the Middle East, that is come up with a positive agenda, lead with efforts at cooperation and reserve the adversarial antagonism for subjects where it really applies.
And I think Congressman Moran talked about Xi Jinping's speech, and certainly it's a challenge for all of us to find a way to engage with a China that's had a very different attitude toward the world
Right.
in recent years, and is looking to find its own place that it considers worthy of the respect it deserves. And that's going to be a challenge for all of us. It's going to spill into the Middle East and elsewhere.
About, let's see, almost 18 years ago, 2004, I talked to the San Francisco World Affairs Council at Asilomar. The title of the talk is the Arabs Take a Chinese Wife, in which I pointed out that in Islam you can have 4 wives, you don't just have to have one, and that the Chinese were in the process of taking advantage of an Arab desire to diversify relationships. And they've done pretty well at that, even though my experience in business as an intermediary between Chinese companies and Arab companies and individuals is that the cultural gap, as Camille said, is huge. I often felt in these discussions that I was performing the role of the exhaust fan in a toilet, removing the stink from the room so that everyone could be civil, which they mostly weren't. I think the Chinese start with disadvantages in the Middle East. They have their own problems. John, you outlined many of those, and I agree with you, those are there. But the key to all this is, as you said, for us to develop a positive agenda and for us to put some resources behind it. Now, how we can do that when we suffer from what I call fiscal anorexia, that is, we imagine that we're overtaxed, but we won't fund anything except through credit card rollovers. And we object to Chinese projects, but provide no offer to do those projects ourselves, this just isn't going to work. So we have to have a positive agenda, and we're going to start addressing some of our own domestic problems, which cripple us internationally. How credible is our case for democracy when we're not even sure we're going to have a peaceful transition in 2024? How credible is our case for our economic system when we bungle things like COVID, when we have pockets of poverty and deprivation? How persuasive are we when our society is as divided as it is? So we need to get our act together at home, and then we need to project a positive vision abroad rather than tell everybody, as you said, John, what we're against, but not what we're for.
Our next question is from Michelle Steinberg, who is a research consultant with MJS Associates based in the US. It's directed towards Ambassador Freeman, but again, anybody can comment. She's asking if you could please elaborate on your remark that it would be in America's interest to share the burden with China to safeguard world energy and trade routes. If possible, could you kind of sketch out a scenario how that could develop?
Well, as I mentioned, if the United States is no longer regards itself as solely responsible for the maintenance of global prosperity, the implication is that you need to find partners. China is the driver of the global economy now to an extent that much of the growth in the global economy derives from China. And it is the major consumer of petroleum products. It's anomalous not to find a way to work with the Chinese. Question is, do we have an interest in securing Chinese oil supplies or in preventing a dust-up between the Indian Navy and the Chinese Navy over that subject? That's a question only we can answer. But I note that when the tanker was seized in the Strait of Hormuz, and we called for an international response rather than mounting one ourselves, one of the few countries that said they would join was China. And we, of course, brushed that aside because we saw them as unacceptable. I think we're going to have to get used to the fact that we're living in a world where we are no longer omnipotent, where our responsibilities have to be reduced to the level we can sustain. And then we have to be willing to have new partners. In a way, we are trying to do that with India. But that's not enough. Japan, South Korea, China, even Taiwan, all share an interest in the security of navigation to the Persian Gulf. Perhaps we should be thinking about carving that out, compartmentalizing that. And I don't think that's impossible. But that requires a level of strategic vision that I don't see. To go back to John's comments on how the Russians parlayed a very small military investment in Syria into a major diplomatic and strategic role, I think they see, and we're seeing this again with the crisis in Ukraine, they see the use of military force as a support for strategy and diplomacy. We see it as something in and of itself. That's a mistake. We need to think about the fact we have enormous military power. How are we going to use that to the advantage of our economy, our political position, to the advantage of our geopolitical influence? The answer is not in mounting bombing campaigns whenever challenged, whether they're conducted by people or by drones. So I think we need to reconsider, and part of the reconsideration ought to be looking at the question of how we might construct a coalition to support the security of global energy supplies while we phase down hydrocarbon usage and move to renewable energy. It's going to be interesting if we don't find such a coalition? Are we really prepared to resume the burden? John, you suggested we might be if the chips were down. I'm not so sure.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. So we are now at noon. However, I have one quick final question for Congressman Moran to tie up the entire panel. You mentioned that there was a bit of a potential shortcoming in the FY23 defense bill in terms of China, that it focuses on conventional war, but that we're still very vulnerable when it comes to cyber conflict and economic relations, et cetera. How do you think Congress, or what do you think Congress should prioritize in the next defense bill in order to ensure that the US remains influential and secure in the Middle East, especially in comparison to China?
I think that we need to put much greater emphasis upon the reality of our cyber vulnerability. There's much more at stake. There is no country that is going to challenge the United States in a conventional military manner. Our defense budget, which totals approximately $750 billion every year, it's more than 10 times what Russia's is, or even China's. It's as large as the next 15 countries really combined. But when we fought the Iraq war and the Afghan war, we funded it not out of the defense budget, but out of what we called overseas contingency operations, because those were emergency appropriations that didn't have to be offset. Much of our defense budget is based upon our industrial complex, and it's driven in some ways by our prime defense contractors. I think we have to make a shift towards greater innovation, more efficiency, and a realization that the real threat is a cyber threat, not a threat from conventional military armaments. It's going to cost us less, frankly. But it would mean a substantial loss of jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs, really, in terms of those who build our weaponry throughout the United States. And of course, those centers of industrial activity for the defense establishment, they're strategically located. They're in every congressional district. Just to bring this back to the politics that guides much of our policy, with the defense budget, there is a matter of politics involved, and there's more jobs at stake in terms of maintaining the current industrial development of conventional weapons rather than cyber. But even when we talk about our priorities, do we ignore the Uyghurs? Do we continue to ignore the Palestinian issue largely? And other situations, Kashmir and so on, it's driven by local politics. For example, and I know you all know this, the number of Jewish people in the United States is just about equal to the number of Muslim people. There may be more Muslim people, but there is far less involvement in the American political process, and that makes a difference. Our priorities, our policy is supposed to be developed in a way that is reflective of what the vast majority of the American people want. But it's really driven by those who choose to be involved, who choose to be educated, to speak out, and to make a difference. And I would like to see what Muslim diaspora in the United States there is. They need to get more involved, frankly, in the political process if they want some of this change that's clearly happening to be directed in a different direction. So these panels are terrific, but they're usually limited to those who are extraordinarily well informed, and they're not a random sample of the American electorate. I think the American electorate, frankly, needs to be much more engaged in foreign policy. and the respective diasporas ought to speak their mind and make more of a difference than a great many of them choose to do. In other words, too many people who are here or don't feel as though they have a sufficient role in the political determination of our foreign policy, and I think that that's evident in the direction we take. So I appreciate being included in this panel again. It's been a very well-informed panel, and I appreciate the fact that we have a substantial audience because it is a very important issue. Thanks, Bessemer.
Thank you, Congressman. Spoken like a true member of the U.S. House of Representatives. We appreciate you encouraging civic engagement, and I couldn't agree more on the Muslim American community. We're just seeing more of a recent, well-organized group coming up with Engage and other groups trying to organize the Muslim American vote and the Muslim American community. So everybody, thank you. This was such a phenomenal panel. I found it to be so fascinating. When I first started at MEPC, I thought 2 hours was like way too long for this kind of thing, but now I feel like they're not long enough. So anyways, everyone, thank you again. And please follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and feel free to subscribe to our mailing list if you're not already. All right, goodbye.